Well, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you both for coming. My name is Megan Mays. I'm the research manager here with Nebraska Cancer Specialists.
Well, thank you for coming.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been with this practice for 4.5 years. When I started here with the practice, we were just a small group. It was actually myself and another. It was a nurse coordinator, and we've grown by leaps and bounds, offering patients now about access to 150 different clinical trials. So,
wow.
These physicians are passionate. We're passionate about the research that we do and that we bring to our patients. So this is really just kind of an intro to research. My background, I've got a graduate degree in business. I have an undergraduate degree in biology. I also have a certification for clinical research through the Association of Clinical Research Professionals. I've been in research a little over 10 years, and I love it. I did early phase research prior to joining Nebraska Cancer, and oncology research is definitely my passion. So I'm very grateful to be doing what I'm doing every day. So I just want to give you guys a little bit of background on research. So clinical research is essentially, we're investigating different treatment medications, different devices. We're basically looking at different treatment options for patients. So with research, there are different phases to clinical trials. Phase 0 are the first trials that are done among humans. They look at how a drug is processed and how it affects the body. These trials are done on a very, very small number of people. About 10 to 15 people are tested. Here at Nebraska Cancer, we don't do phase 0 trials per se. We focus more, our aim is phase 1 to phase 4 trials. Phase 1 trials, we're looking at finding the best dose of a medication without the least amount of side effects. So we're testing a drug safety in about 15 to 30 people. And in phase 1, in cancer research, oftentimes phase 1 trials are done on several different disease indications. We do clinical trials on advanced malignancies, so they're not subject necessarily to a certain disease. Our phase 2 clinical trials, we're looking at safety and how well the drug works. We're giving that treatment to a specific patient population, whether it be diabetic patients or cancer patients. We're looking at that certain patient population, and we're looking at the new combinations of the drugs that are being tested. Phase 3 trials, we're looking at a new drug or a combination of drug, and we're comparing it to the standard of care, so what's already been approved by the FDA. These trials are probably the most popular trials that we do here because those are tested on a large patient population. We're looking at the investigational treatment to see how it compares to what's already approved. And those phase 3 trials are done from anywhere from 150 people onward up to over 1,000 people. And then phase 4 trials those are trials that are done on a medication that's been approved by the FDA. And that's just, they're looking at those trials, and they're looking at that medication in thousands of patients. They're looking to gain better research on the certain side effects, as rare side effects may only be found in a larger patient population and may not have been found in the phase 3 research. So typically, a clinical trial has to go through all of these phases before FDA approval. So it's very regimented in how the process works. Any questions on phases or?
What's the biggest study you got here that you're working with?
That's a good question. We have, the biggest trial. I would say we've got a breast cancer trial that they are enrolling over 1,500 patients worldwide. So we don't necessarily enroll 1,500 patients here in Omaha, but we're part of a network of research sites, clinical practices that enroll patients. So, but typically phase 3 trials are where we do majority of our research. We do have some phase 1 trials. Our phase 1 trials are done here at this legacy office. So, and we do a handful of phase 2 as well. I would say phase 2 and phase 3 are definitely our more prevalent trials that we do. So the trial designs, each trial is designed a little bit different, and the designs are always based off the recommendations of the FDA. The FDA is who mandates and who gives us approval for new drugs or new combinations. So an open label trial design means that everybody involved in the clinical trial knows what medication the patient's going to receive. So the patient would know, the physician, the pharmacist, anybody involved in the trial will know what they're receiving. A single blind trial is a trial designed where somebody involved in the research, in the clinical trial, knows what the patient's receiving. And that's typically designed where the pharmacist would know what the patient's receiving, but the patient, the research nurse, the physician isn't going to know necessarily what the patient's receiving. And a double-blinded trial is where basically nobody involved knows what the patient is receiving. A drug or placebo is packaged in a similar bottle or vial. So when it's dispensed, we don't know if it is the drug or if it's a placebo. So in that statement, in cancer research, when we have a trial design where we've got a drug or a placebo, it's always given with a already approved medication. So we're not giving a patient something unethical where they're not receiving a treatment of any kind. It's either you're receiving the investigational drug or the placebo with another treatment. So you're getting some form of a treatment, if that makes sense. So an institutional review board. So all clinical trials, when we bring a clinical trial to our office, we have to get approval by an institutional review board, also known as an IRB. And what an institutional review board is it's a group formally designed to essentially to protect the safety and well-being of the patients, the subjects involved in the research. So the review board is going to review all aspects of the clinical trial. They're going to look at the protocol. They're going to look at data that was even done preclinical that's in the investigator brochure. They're going to look at advertising, how we advertise these clinical trials, if we use social media or send a flyer. They're going to look at that. The informed consent document, how we notify how we give the patient information on the clinical trial. The review board has to review and approve all documents related to the clinical trial. The review board also has to approve the individuals that are conducting the trial at the research site. The institutional review board, they are comprised of members from all aspects of life, meaning that one member has to have a non-scientific background, and one member must not be affiliated with the institution or the trial site. And the institutional review board has to have at least 5 members. So we use, here at our office, we use what's called a central institutional review board. So some institutions have a local institutional review board, and oftentimes that happens at a big academic center, the university. They're going to have committees committees, multiple committees, and then an institutional review board that the research has to go through to get approved. We utilize a central institutional review board, so we essentially don't have that middleman. We're sending our protocols to the institutional review board for approval. So our office, we can get a trial up and running in about a month, which is great because that's, another treatment option that we can offer our patients. So in that, I had mentioned that we have a document called an informed consent document. So the informed consent, this is the most important document in research. This is the document that is giving it's the ethical obligation and the legal requirement for the researcher. This is how we are informing the patient of the trial, what's to be expected, why the research is being done, side effects that they've seen, the procedures involved, other treatment options. The informed consent is a document that reviews every bit and piece of that clinical trial. I refer to it as a working document because as new information is gained while we're conducting the trial, the informed consent gets updated. So we re-inform the patient of the updates to the consent. So it's a document that could require multiple reviews and signatures among the patient and the researcher. And the principal investigator, the physician, the lead physician involved, has to personally review the ICF or delegate the review to a qualified research coordinator. So here at Nebraska Cancer Specialists, going into my next slide, the process for an informed consent and how we work to integrate that into patient care is the physician always will discuss the clinical trial with the patient, a potential clinical trial that we have available. The physician or usually our research team will then meet with the patient or call the patient after the patient has seen the physician and discuss the clinical trial and give the informed consent to the potential patient. We always want to give the patient enough time to really review that document. The documents, they're not little documents, they're 25-page documents that you've got to review. And we typically give that or we email it and then give the patient a chance to review it. So typically my team calls the patient usually a day or two to just see if they have any questions during their review. If the patient decides that they're interested in enrolling into the clinical trial, then what we do is we schedule the patient to come meet with one of our research team members to discuss the clinical trial. And we schedule them just at essentially an office visit, but you're meeting directly with our research team, and we go through that consent form page by page and really review it in detail, because it's amazing to me how different the interpretation can be amongst just a patient, and then when somebody's rereading and giving you that information, just how different it sounds. So it's important that we review it and go through, each page and the procedures and risks involved in the trial. The patient at that time, after they've had enough adequate amount of time to review and answer any questions, we will then see if the patient wants to move forward with signing the consent. Keep in mind that when we do our research review with patients, we always have a physician or a mid-level provider available if there's any medical questions that we can't answer. They're always present to answer the questions. So once a patient signs the informed consent, the patient has to receive a copy of the signed consent, and then we detail the consent process in the patient's medical record, and it's got to be a very, very descriptive, detailed documentation of the process. Any questions on that? Okay. So oftentimes with clinical trials, we get questions on coverage, insurance coverage. When I have patients tell me, well, I'm on a clinical trial, everything should be covered. Well, that's not the case. So clinical trial coverage, it really truly depends on the patient's insurance policies. Insurance companies will have established services where scientific data is available to support it versus investigational procedures. And that's kind of how they weigh in on what's paid for by insurance and what's paid for by the research, clinical trial itself. Medicare approved clinical trials, so Medicare approves a majority of clinical trials. If they're funded by the National Cancer Institute or a designated NCI-sponsored trials, they're always covered by Medicare. Also, if they're focused on the diagnosis and the treatment of cancer, Medicare covers the trial. On clinical trials, there are what we call patient care costs. Patient care costs are going to be your routine costs. So if a patient is coming in to meet with Dr. Liu for a monthly visit, that's something that what we would consider a standard of care visit. You're going to meet with your doctor regardless of your clinical trial, if you're on clinical trial or not. Research costs would be costs associated with clinical trial participation. So maybe blood collection that's done for research purposes. Maybe the clinical trial is looking at how much drug is in your body after you've taken the medication after you've taken it for an hour. That's going to be paid for by the research trial itself because that's being done solely for the purpose of that clinical trial. And how we kind of weigh that in is when we are looking at a clinical trial, if it's considered a standard of care item, we have a standard of care versus a research, a non-standard of care, something that's done for research. Cancer research, our trials require a biopsy if you don't have an archival tumor sample. That instance, majority of time that's considered an investigational procedure. The research study itself is going to pay for that. When we have to get a patient on clinical trial, we have to go through a number of tests and procedures to get the patient enrolled on trial. That could be anywhere from just lab work to CT scans to a biopsy. And sometimes just because of the timing of the new treatment, some of those items are considered investigational and are billed to the clinical trial. So, any questions on that?
Has that changed over the years?
I would say it's gotten better, actually. I know when I first started back in 2013, it seems like we had more clinical trial denials than we do now. And I think, I don't know if it's just education, people are more educated about the clinical trials and, what's covered and what's not. And, the investigational treatment's always covered on clinical trial. Sometimes it's kind of nice. We've actually got a trial now where we've got the clinical trial pays for all treatment on it. And one of the treatment arms is standard of care. And that treatment it's very expensive. So it's definitely can be an advantage.
It's very expensive.
What's very expensive?
Yeah. I don't know my deal, so I'm just curious. It's thousands of dollars a month? Is it...
Thousands a month, yeah. I don't know the exact number, but it's thousands, So, but there are those type of certainly advantages sometimes to participation in a clinical trial. That doesn't happen very often when we've got a trial where there's a standard of care treatment. Typically, the investigational treatment is covered by research, and then the standard of care treatment that you're getting in combination with the investigational, that's usually billed to insurance. But sometimes we get lucky with the trials and they'll cover everything. So, and then I just have a slide a little bit about our team. So we have a dedicated research staff, our picture, and we've actually added a few more staff members since that picture was taken last fall. We've got a team of research nurses, a research coordinator, research assistant. We've got a regulatory coordinator that makes sure we're approved to do these clinical trials and keeps up with all of our training and all the documentation that's involved in research. And then our data management team, our team that is getting the data that the clinical trial needs for review. We have over 150 clinical trials available to patients, and we actually enrolled this last year the first patient in the world to a phase 2 prostate cancer trial. And then recently, within the last month, we enrolled the first patient in the US to a lung cancer trial. So exciting stuff that's being done just here with Nebraska Cancer Specialists. And if you guys ever have need any more information on clinical trials, I just have our clinical trials list is located on our website, and it's just nebraskacancer.com. And you click on clinical trials, and it'll give you a list of clinical trials. And then clinicaltrials.gov is a resource that all clinical trials that are being conducted in the world have to be inputted into this database. So if you're trying to search for a particular medication that you've heard, has good results, you can go to clinicaltrials.gov and check out the trials that are being done.
Everybody registers through there is what you're saying.
It's a good place. All of the drug companies, anybody that's doing research, they have to register their trial through at that website.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So anything
whatever's visible is something that I can ask about.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. And then my last is just my, when you've exhausted all possibilities, remember this, you haven't. So clinical trials is definitely a passion of mine. I think it's awesome to be able to offer patients another treatment option. I always tell, there's always the standard of care treatment. And the standard of care treatment started from a clinical trial. So it's definitely, they're definitely not for everybody, but it's truly a wonderful field to work in.